Great. Cool. I said we'll have a next presentation first and then take some questions. I imagine that opener has already led to a lot of questions percolating in people's minds. The next talk I've got down as being 30 minutes between Dr. Fraser Sugden and Megan McInnes from Community Land Scotland. Fraser Sugden is a political economist at the University of Birmingham who has conducted extensive research on land reform, landlord-tenant relations and collective farming with work spanning Nepal, India, China and Scotland. Those I think you'll be starting in a moment and then passing over to Megan, who's in the room somewhere, going out, and has worked on land reform for over 25 years, covering community land rights, natural resource governance in Southeast Asia, Scotland and around the world. Megan is also the local development manager for the Applecross Community Company and was previously a commissioner at the Scottish Land Commission as well. So I think 15 minutes each. I'll pass over to you, Fraser, to start.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I've had a few issues with internet here, so apologies if I do cut out at all. So what basically I'm going to talk a little bit about is some of the history, so how Scotland came to be one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of land ownership, but also how its historical experience is matched by other countries globally. And also in the context of, this presentation emerges from the discussion workshop we had in June on the ICARD +20, and think a little bit about how the land question in Scotland aligns with other low and middle income countries globally. Scotland is a high-income country, so say how that kind of can link in with experiences in lower-income countries in particular. So the historical precedents really for land inequality in Scotland, like many other parts of the world, particularly in the sort of Eurasian region, really lies in the transition from a kind of more lineage-based sort of feudal land ownership system. Creeping feudalisation, which took place particularly after the 12th century, whereby this idea that land which had previously belonged to kind of communities or belonged to lineages began to increasingly be considered as something which belonged to individuals. Now, this is a geographically uneven process, particularly started along the eastern coast of the lowlands, then central belt, particularly under David I, the introduction of Norman law, distribution of titles to Anglo-Norman and Flemish knights. And this is a very common medieval state-building strategy to kind of rein in tribal peripheries. And you see this across, South Asia, China, many parts of the world. Second wave of feudalisation, of course, is more heavily restricted to the highlands and also the southern uplands, which had been until at least the 17th century under sort of de facto clan-based land ownership, even if titles had official ownership titles endorsed by the state. Yet there was this kind of increasing feudalisation by the 17th to 18th century as the Scottish and then British state sought to extend its influence over the region. So the monetisation of rents, the anglicisation of the kind of old clan aristocracy, and the distribution of withdrawal of kind of legal titles to land. And then you had an extra land grabs later, for example, following the Reformation, when church lands were seized. What's particularly interesting, I think the reason that Scotland is particularly severe in terms of the distribution of land, particularly in the agro-pastoral zone, is the fact that it was historically extensive rather than intensive land use. So that's why you really have vast, historical transhumance-based economies shown here. This was so central to livelihoods that, the territories were large. So when sort of clans became dissolved, then huge areas of land, far greater than anywhere else in Europe, fell into the hands of single individuals. It's very interesting now to compare Scotland's Enlightenment experience. So, like many parts of the world, Scotland was a landlord economy by the 18th century, like large parts of Europe as well. However, what was interesting on mainland Europe, Enlightenment supported a challenge to landlord authority. Now, the French Revolution, for example, saw the abolition of feudalism, serfs became owners, there's a redistribution of church lands. Denmark, which had an extremely unequal land ownership system, saw reform to land tenure, and many of the kind of serfs and tenants became independent landowners in the sort of late 18th and early 19th century. Then Russia, even long before the Communist Revolution, there was the Emancipation Act of 1861. It freed the serfs or tenants, who were a third of the population, who were bonded to landlords. They were provided land, allotments of land, and this is before the Crofting Act, and long over a much greater extent of territory. And in Ireland as well, particularly in the wake of the famine, the 19th century land laws set the kind of foundations for the decline in landlord authority. However, Scotland Enlightenment the kind of sorry.
So just to interrupt you for a minute, your slides aren't moving on for us in the room. I don't know if there's a way of changing the view.
I don't. Right,
Sorry to
don't know. I'm not sure how to do that.
Maybe we'll.
Oh yeah, that's true, Tom. I think if you click Tom current slide up there, that might work.
Can you see the different slide now?
Yes, but we've still got the PowerPoint around it, but I think that's okay if that's
slideshow, Patrick.
Can you, is it changing?
It is, but I think you need to go onto slideshow if you click Thumb current slide in the top left. And then
I am on slideshow.
It might be that this is showing in your other monitor, and you need to swap them over.
I only got one monitor, actually. I'm just going straight from the laptop. So, should I just
stop sharing?
Let me try resharing again, see if that makes a difference. Right. Is it changing now?
It's
not sharing.
It's coming.
Yay. Is this now changing? Okay.
Right, thank you.
No problem at all. Yep. So yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So where was I? Go back. Yeah. So it's all about Russia, Ireland. So yeah, basically Scotland's experience of Enlightenment was of course very different. So the violent imposition of capitalism and commercial production in both lowlands and highlands. Remember, the clearances, of course, was not just a Highland affair. You saw appropriation of land by both the sort of anglicised chiefs turned landlords, as well as the kind of neo-elite of lowland Scots and English capitalists. Now, crofting, of course, was a temporary political settlement, in a way, cynic would say, to create a captive labour force for the kelp and fishing industry, but it was not a genuine land reform, at least when you look at it in the global context. Moving into the 20th century, you had, of course, the communist century, revolutions across Asia, which kind of abolished feudal landlordism in countries like Russia, China, Central Asia, Cuba, and Vietnam. Then a wave of redistributive reforms also took place outside of the communist bloc. And interestingly, these were driven heavily by decolonization, but also Cold War geopolitics, actually, that Americans supported land reforms in countries like Nepal, for example, to try and create a sort of bulwark against communism. And this kind of wave of reforms entirely bypassed Scotland and England. Ireland, moving into later periods, they also confiscated the estates of landlords in 1923. This sort of saw the end of landlordism in Ireland, which was kind of created by the British. And then Mexico, major land reforms, 57% of the national territory was redistributed. A third of the lands owned by large landowners is given to landless peasants and grouped into ejidos, or kind of ejidos, I should say, or collective lands, which are something similar in concept to the idea of community ownership today. Nepal also saw the abolition of the old zimidari system, again, a sort of landlord system, some redistribution of holdings, but it was not so successful there. And Japan and Korea, possibly some of the most successful sort of non-communist land reforms, which kind of actually paved the way for the economic takeoff in these countries, set ceilings on what could be loans, forced landlords to sell at a fixed price. So this is kind of the post. So you had the sort of Enlightenment era, then the early 20th century, and then this kind of post-war, post-colonial land reform wave. Latin America, I think Penelope will talk about this later a little bit. So a wave of land reforms which imposed the ceilings on holdings and successfully contributed to the breakup of Latifundia state. Very varied experience, but particularly the state of West Bengal saw highly successful land reforms, and the state of Kerala, whereby landlords had their lands essentially seized and it was redistributed, and tenants were given legal rights to inherit the land after 5 years. So in Scotland, in spite of obviously what in Michael Russell's presentation, there has of course been a really exciting development over the last few decades, but true redistributive reform in comparison to what has happened in other parts of the world is really off the agenda. The reasons for this are complex. It may be due to the fact that the peasantry, this legacy of violent break from the land, means there's this kind of loss of collective heritage, links to ancestral lands amongst much of the Scottish population have been severed entirely. So this kind of political aspect or political need has perhaps dissipated. Then, of course, you've got community ownership, but again, as Michael mentioned, it's a tiny fraction. I think it's currently about 2.6% of the total land area. The community ownership, of course, paves the way for a really potentially radical future of land reform. And this is really where Scotland sets apart from other parts of the world today. Opportunities to kind of build upon this long of communal land management, particularly in the Highlands, and also has a potential to support, innovation, repopulation, and, rural development. But this is a paradox because this kind of quite radical vision is at odds with this commitment to the market principle. Land reform in Scotland is grounded in this principle of, willing buyer, willing seller. However, similar collective regimes such as the ejidos of Mexico, they emerged out of the redistribution of around 20 million hectares of land. In comparison, obviously the amount of land being redistributed through market-based reforms in Scotland is tiny. And the willing buyer, willing seller approach actually has a very, very poor track record in the global south. I was involved in dialogue with the government in Nepal around this, and they were very critical of this idea of willing buyer, willing seller. It's seen as an approach to appease landed interests. The basic principle is that genuine land reform doesn't depend on the goodwill or business imperatives of landlords to sell. And most 20th century land reforms and 21st century initiatives are based upon a ceiling whereby it's considered politically, morally, and economically unacceptable for a single individual to own a huge tract of land. And there's also been shown that the costs of market-based reforms are often out of reach for the most marginal users. Just to kind of give, South Africa, Colombia, it was a massive failure. Just to kind of put things in perspective, the Scottish Land Fund budget is around 10 million a year. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I know there's a lot of experts who know this better than me. But just to give another example, in 2022 alone, estate agent Savills put 246,000 acres for sale with a total estimated value of 347 million. So it's really a drop in the ocean, what's available through the Land Fund budget. Kind of final thoughts really is it's really important that we try and break free from this sort of market principle. So community ownership becomes the standard model basically in rural areas. And it's really, you need to think about ceilings and forced redistribution or compulsory purchases. There's also questions about, how we reconnect with the land to create the political will and political demand at a grassroots level for land reform. Remember, 3/4 of the Scottish population is urban, and all of us who live in cities in Scotland, at least most who are descendant of those living in cities, have ancestors who would have been dispossessed historically. So there needs to be kind of an ideological shift whereby land isn't considered just a site of elite leisure or sport or where you go for hill walking. You need to move away.
Unfortunate final line.
I think we've lost you, Fraser, but it sounds like you are on your final thoughts.
Scandinavia, for example.
You're back. You just dropped out for a few moments, but I think you were just summing up.
Hi, yeah. Can you still hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so no, I was basically summing up, and I was just saying about Scotland is far behind many other countries in terms of this reconnection with nature, small-scale food production, market gardens, much more developed on mainland Europe compared to Scotland. And this, in a way, I think is because of this sort of violent dispossession, this legacy which we all bear in Scotland itself. That's everything. Thank you very much.